Dzień dobry Państwu, serdecznie
Good
witam Państwa
afternoon,
na
ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the opening of World in Focus, the third edition of Warsaw International Meeting. This name is not coincidence. This is not an expert conference where representatives of think tanks take place and share their views and opinions. This is a meeting of people from various backgrounds, various circles. We host here experts, but also ordinary citizens who are interested in international affairs, European affairs. I do hope that your presence here means that you enjoy this seminar and you will be satisfied this year as well. I hope that after 2 days of meetings you will be full of new ideas and insights as to what's going on in the world right now. Welcome very warmly on behalf of the European Council of Foreign Relations and Heinrich Böll Foundation as the organizers of this event. We are co-organizers of World in Focus. We've been launching this project for a couple of years now in Paris, in Berlin and in Warsaw. This is the third year in a row that we host this gathering in Warsaw, and we are really glad that the capital city of Warsaw is the strategic partner of this gathering. On behalf of Hanna Gronkiewicz-Waltz, let me welcome you to Praga Północ, Center of Creativity in Prague, which is very exceptional also with respect to the topics that are going to be discussed here. This is the place where the citizens of Warsaw have the opportunity to meet and talk about new solutions, new ideas. We can host lots of startups from the creative sector here, and we will talk about creativity during this gathering. That's why I'm so pleased. Welcome on behalf of Warsaw. Who holds the power now? This question is really pressing right now. Technology is one of the tools that holds power right now, and we can see that using small experiment that you took part in during registration. We used small black box which divided us into two groups, red group and blue group, and that's what it looks like in today's world. Different kinds of algorithms divide us into different segments, segments full of knowledge that is sold to research centers, political campaigns and different kinds of entities, and your reactions to putting your hands into that black box with various. This was a kind of experiment, and this reflects reality. We have to sometimes accept the fact that we don't understand everything that's going on in the world today. Thank you very much for participating in this experiment, and we are really glad that you've asked so many questions, because that's what we meant. A world in focus. That's the stage, that's the platform to ask all the questions that you have at the back of your head. And we gathered lots of different topics to present you with lots of interesting content. We asked all the partner organizations from Poland, both the ones that have been cooperating with us for a number of years, for instance, College of Eastern Europe, Collegium Civitas, but also new organizations that have not cooperated with us, for instance, Kuchnia Konfliktu, Spięcie Project and Panoptykon. So we are really glad to be able to expand the network of partners. Piotr, please tell us what we are going to do in the next 2 days. Well, let me very briefly invite you to the next two debates on where the power lies right now. Then what awaits us is a debate on the sovereignty in the European Union, and tomorrow we are going to have a number of interesting meetings and debates. For instance, who holds power over our food? We are also going to discuss issues related to climate and the fact why climate is important from the political perspective. Voting rights for women, that's another topic for tomorrow. Let me just mention a couple of distinguished guests. I won't be able to name all of them, but let me mention four of them which are particularly close to our two organizations. We've got three members of the Council, of the European Council on Foreign Relations, Galeotti, Sylvie Kauffmann and Flavia Kleiner, as well as Ralph Fuchs, who's for many years been president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and tomorrow he's going to present his book. But we are hosting here a number of distinguished guests, so I encourage you really warmly to come today as well as tomorrow and listen to what they have to say. There is simultaneous interpretation into Polish and English. Headsets are available if you need interpretation. What else should I tell you? Well, we would like to ask the most important people. If it were not for them, this gathering would not take place. Andrzej Medelny-Korowicz and Małgorzata Kopka. They are crucial for the functioning of this very event. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank Miłosz Gołysz, who works in the Department of International Project, and he was crucial for the organization of this event. And when it comes to the schedule of this meeting, tomorrow in the Museum of Prague, which is next to this building, there will be some animation provided for your children. So if your family would like to join us, take part in this meeting, but you have no one to take care of your kids, then at the Museum of Prague between 10 and 4 p.m., well, kids are invited and very much welcome to take part in very interesting workshops. And let me just remind you what's been going on so far, because you might have already taken part in some plenary sessions here. One of them was devoted to the world of education. The discussion was really exceptional, and I would like to thank the Office of Education of the capital city of Warsaw, which co-hosted the session. Many people say that the power is held by schools right now in the way we teach our children. Please think about that. That would be it. Thank you so much. We know what's awaiting us. We know who to leave our kids with. We know whom we should extend our thanks to. That's why let me pronounce this gathering, Warsaw International Gathering, World in Focus, open. And now I would like to invite to the podium the participants of the first session. Who holds the power now? Sylvie Kauffmann, journalist and editor of Le Monde, the moderator of the session. Professor Zielonka, University of Oxford, European Studies. Mark Galeotti, Institute of International Affairs in Prague. And last but not least, Flavia Kleiner, activist and founder of the Swiss political movement Operation Libero.
Dzień dobry. It's about, I'm not going to try to speak Polish. Sorry, I'll switch to English. So I am Sylvie Kauffmann. I'm a journalist with Le Monde, and I'm also, as was mentioned, associated with ECFR. And it's my third Chiat Potupon. I'm very glad to be here and to follow this, to continue this tradition. So we are going to talk about power, which is, of course, a huge subject, a very wide subject. It's at the center of everything. It even decided whether we were red or blue, and apparently we're all red because Jan refused to be red, I understand, no? Or, but, yeah, okay, so we don't know which power have these badges. Maybe we'll get to know more in the course of this conference. So power can be hard, can be soft, can be smart. It is a tool of government in public affairs, but it can also be a goal. And it can be exercised in many ways and by very many different actors. The way it is exercised in the public sphere will very much determine or help to define what kind of political regime or what kind of system of international relations we live in. So who holds power now? Who are the new actors? This is what we are going to discuss with our three panelists who will bring very different perspectives. So Jan Zielonka, who is a professor of European politics at Antony's College at the University of Oxford. Mark Galeotti, who is an expert on international relations, security, Russia, transnational crime, so he knows a lot about power, hard power, and he's now at the European University Institute in Florence. And Flavia Kleiner is founded this operation. She will tell us more about Opération Libéraux, which she created in 2016 in Switzerland to defend this organization managed to defeat a bill allowing to deport foreigners with a small army of volunteers. So this is another way of exercising power, and she will tell us more about this. So Jan, why don't you start giving us your perspective about power, and then we'll continue, we'll discuss it also between ourselves, and then we'll give you the floor for whatever questions you may have. So I think Jan will speak in Polish, right? Yeah? Yes. Very good. Yes, he can.
Good afternoon. It's also my third time in the world of focus. My Polish is not getting any better, but I will try. You can ask me, well, why is Zielonka speaking about power? He's never been in power. He's never performed any official function. He's never had any influence, even over his sons. But I have one advantage over others. I have no conflict of interest. I don't want to tell you any bullshit. But there is no answer to the question who holds the power right now, or at least I don't have the answer to this question. Just like you, I watch TV sometimes, I listen to the radio, and I can hear President Trump saying that he's the most genius president of America. But if he has so much power, why can't he cope with Kim? Or with Iran? Or with China? My colleagues from the left-hand side of the political scene say that democracy has lost control over markets, who can do whatever they want. in a way that even Marx could not have imagined. But the consequence is that lots of entrepreneurs are losing their money, lots of money, not only 10 years ago, but also now, as it turns out that markets that are left to themselves without any regulations, legal regulations, that would result from democratic procedures, conduct joint suicide, so to speak. It seems that democracy and markets are left to each other, and they have to cooperate, because if they do not, they die. They cease to exist. Let me give you another example. Liberalism influenced our awareness. It seems to us that it's an ordinary thing to trade, to support democracy, human rights, European integration. But then it turns out that the parties that are successful in elections have totally different demands and claims. And it's not only in Russia, Turkey. Okay, they profit from the developments in Europe and in the world. But it's in Poland and in other countries in Europe and all over the world that such parties gain in power. That's why it's really difficult to say who holds the power right now. Well, it seems there are different kinds of power. There is ideological power, legal power, military power, administrative power. There is no single type of power. On top of that, power can be formal or informal. It can be real or symbolic. Also, geography of power differs, both in territorial context and in the social context. There are elites and ordinary citizens. Power is always relative. There are those who have more power and those who have little power or less power. That's why we are talking about those who hold them, who hold power, and those who don't hold it. But even if it seems that some people do not hold any power, they can influence the course of history. Let's think about Mahatma Gandhi. Stalin asked how many divisions did the Vatican have. Power has its sources as well. What are the sources of power? Economic strength, military strength, but also knowledge, access to information, access to the media. These are all important sources of power. Power uses different kinds of instruments, sanctions or incentives, carrot or stick. These tools are very different. This could be money or a tank. Different kinds of tools which might help or which may act to the detriment, because power without aims and values has no sense, ceases to exist. Power is of importance only if its aim is to fulfill certain values or interests. Interests are always based on certain values. They always refer to certain values. And not all the instruments of power are supportive to achieve what we want to achieve. Napoleon said, you can do lots of different things with swords, but you cannot sit on them. So it's really important to decide what to do with power. I've always thought that The strongest power is the power that is able to define our notion of rationality. Power that convinces us that certain actions are simply normal, ordinary, that everything else is not rational, is not logical, is simply stupid. If we are able to convince others that we have an idea how to make people safer and wealthier, we don't need to impose any sanctions or introduce any incentives. They are going to act according to what we've shown them because they will think this is the best way to achieve economic growth and success. In what sense? In a certain sense, the European Union has had power. I can remember times where everyone wanted to copy what we do. Everyone wanted to be part of the European Union, even if that meant that they needed to accept thousands of regulations. But today, the situation has changed, as we all know. Who holds power today?
Who has the power? The United States of America, Vatican, or Microsoft? Is it President Trump? Or is it President Putin, or should I say Tsar Putin? Or maybe a celebrity like Bono or Beyoncé or Kardashians. Exactly. So everyone could name a celebrity of his or her choice. I don't know. However, since you've tried to help me, maybe you could elaborate on this. Maybe you could continue and tell us who holds the power in your opinion and how you would like to change the world to the better. And do you have an idea how this can be done? I think this would be the best idea we could have for the future, how to change it to the better.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you. And thank you for making the transition much easier for me.
I hope I didn't
He has the
interrupt you.
power to chair this panel, I think, so that's very good. No. So Flavia, please.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here and to tell you the story of me as an ordinary citizen I am as well. And it's a bit the history of David against Goliath, I think, because I give you a quick introduction about the situation in Switzerland so you understand what we did. So, Switzerland is not often part of the avant-garde, but in terms of right-wing populism, I'm afraid we are. We have 29%. With 29%, the right-wing populists are the strongest party in Switzerland. They have 2 ministers in our government, and they define and dominate, out of this powerful position, the public discourse in Switzerland. And in addition to that, they systematically use this tool, which is really special to the Swiss democracy, the so-called initiative. This means if you, as an organization, manage to collect 100,000 signatures, you can change the constitution. And they use this tool quite often, but originally it was a tool given to minorities so that they would, even if they're not represented in parliament, have a chance to influence legislation. But what happens now is that this strong party misuses this tool as a marketing tool. And they came up with popular initiatives on the minaret ban, for example, that was accepted. You have heard of it, I think, internationally. It made us be the heart of darkness of Europe. Then also other votes, one on the expulsion of criminal foreigners, you just mentioned it, Sylvie, but also one just this spring about the abolishing of the public broadcaster in Switzerland. But fortunately, again, we made a campaign and we won against the right-wing populists, and I think it was an important win also if you look across Europe. So, however, I maybe quickly want to speak about what I understand as the power of David in this situation. And basically what we did is that we tried to somehow capture the sovereignty of interpretation from the right-wing populists over their own initiative. And let me explain you this at this one example in this vote about the expulsion of criminal foreigners. So basically, that vote was about asking the Swiss people, guys, don't you think we should expel people who are foreigners and who became criminal out of the country? Quite catchy, right? I mean, you tell people, hey, this is your chance, you don't need to pay with your taxes for any prison of these people. No, this is your chance. You can just expel them. It's so easy. And so we found ourselves in this tricky situation because we knew we cannot move to their battlefield where we would have found ourselves as the defenders of criminal foreigners. You can only lose, right? So we said, no, we are going to define a new battlefield and tell the right-wing populists, hey, you're coming over here, and here you explain us why you are attacking fundamental principles of rule of law, like the principle of proportionality or of the Swiss democracy, because all this would have been accepted by this law. And we managed successfully to conquer, that's what I mean, the sovereignty of interpretation over their own initiative, and I think that was key. And here I come to this point. To me, really, what is powerful these days is the media society, and who is actually successful to define the discourse is one of the most powerful in these days. But to pay on this, we also try to find a really popular way of communication. So, for example, just in this campaign I was mentioning, we were working a lot on with memes, for example, like with fun communication styles. I mean, it's a reality that people want to watch cats videos, so whatever. I mean, we just need to somehow manage to simplify the messages, but not by making them incorrect, don't get me wrong, but just accepting that people only listen to you for 20 seconds. That's the new reality. So another example, we know that when we want to see a majority of the people to really read and understand and hear what we are about to tell them, then we know we need to get to the front page of the most popular newspaper in Switzerland. And this is the 20 Minuten, 20 Minuten. You can imagine when you hear like 20 minutes, the content isn't going very deep, but people read it when they commute, you know. So basically, when you want to get to the front page of this newspaper, you need to be able to put your message in one picture and 5 words. That's all you get. One picture, 5 words. And I think that's a reality we need to respect. And that's what we try to do. And also, of course, we work a lot with social media. We try to get to to people where they are, right? And we're just very much aware that we need to advance to people and not wait them to come. So we need to do the work when we want people to hear what we want to tell them. So basically, what would be my claim is, like, on the one hand, really find a way to conquer the sovereignty of interpretation, and that's a really strategic thing, but also it is, of course, a communication thing about finding popular messages, not being afraid of simplifying the language. And really, again, I'm just saying it, I don't simplify like the content, but I want people to really understand why it matters to them, and that is the main challenge, I think, today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you have addressed, in fact, in a way, what Václav Havel used to call the power of the powerless, except that Swiss citizens still have a power, which is the power of voting, and which is, of course, still a very powerful tool when it is well organized. And you have also addressed an issue we'll come back to, I think, about the power of the media, which is also something which is very much changing. Mark, so as I said earlier, you're an expert of hard power and security, but this is also a field which has been evolving quite a lot. So why don't you tell us about this?
It has. Thank you. I mean, it's always a bit depressing after you've heard about the sort of all the potential within sort of civil society and human motivation to get back to the miserable, grim sort of power, but it's only fitting for the guy wearing black. In a way, I like to think of power as actually being situated somewhere in a triangle. In some ways, there's three different types of power. There's the power of coercion, which is basically you do what I say because you fear the bad things that I will do to you. And yes, that might be I will invade your country. That might be I will put you in prison. Or in the modern age, that might be that I will call you out on social media and my 1.4 million Twitter followers will all think you're a horrible human being. But one way or the other, it's basically power through fear. Then there is a second kind of power, which is a power by co-optation. Power because I can do something for you. And that's why you do what I say. And that might be because the government I run runs the country very well, and we have, roads that are repaired and hospitals that are open and so forth. Or it might be that I'm going to make your brother Minister for Customs, and we all know all the wonderful opportunities that can be got that way. It doesn't have to be good stuff, but one way or the other, I obey you because it's in my personal interests. And then there's the third kind of power, which is the power of legitimacy. I obey you because I think it's right that I obey you, because you're the elected government, because you are the monarch that God selected, because you are the coolest celebrity around, whatever. But it's that kind of willing submission. So all governments, all regimes, all situations, all individuals exist somewhere in that triangle. Even the most democratic and liberal government has an element of coercion. If you keep not paying your taxes, someday someone's going to knock on your door and say, "Come with me." But likewise, even the most unpleasant authoritarian regime has some element of co-optation and legitimacy. You look at North Korea, which is about as horrible a regime as we could think of. But still, there are some people who benefit, even if the benefit is just simply, I am merely hungry, not starving. And there's all the propaganda and everything else to try and build legitimacy. Now, when we come into the realms of hard power, of the use of force and violence to try and control the world, I would say that because the modern world is an exceedingly complex place, there's two processes I think I'd want to mention. The first is the way in which the conventional tools of hard power, force, violence, armies, or whatever, are now being used for other purposes. War, especially war against an equivalent country, is now very, very expensive. It's expensive in economic terms. In real terms, if you take a top-of-the-line fighter plane from World War II, it costs 1/25 of what the latest F-35 super plane that the Americans are selling us all does now. So in other words, for one modern fighter, you could get 25 other sort of top-of-the-line planes. War is just getting very expensive in economic terms. It's also getting expensive politically. And this is a good thing. We're no longer in the kind of days in which governments could send, armies overseas and 1,000 of them die from malaria before they even get to the battlefield. Oh, but that's all right. They're just working-class boys, more of them being bred in the countryside every day or whatever. No, nowadays, every casualty matters. It's a front-page story. It's questions being asked in Parliament. And this is not even just democracies. Why does Vladimir Putin continue to lie about the fact that there are Russian troops in the Donbass, in Ukraine? Because he seriously thinks to convince us that we'll suddenly say, oh my gosh, it was all a mistake. No, he's trying to convince his own public, a public that doesn't want to see Ivan come home soldered into a zinc box from the Donbass or from Syria. Even authoritarian regimes, or most authoritarian regimes, now have to worry about their own public. So, in a way, armies have got into much broader roles. Armies are now not just about force, they're also about co-optation. They're about how you offer jobs to the young men of the parts of your country where there are no other jobs. Or where you take the kind of sort of thuggish person who might become a youth gang member and say, hey, don't worry, you can fight for your country instead, and with better guns. But more generally, it's actually how other countries begin to respect you or begin to think they have a need for you. I mean, this is one of the lines that President Trump's always making. Well, we are protecting Europe, or we're protecting Saudi Arabia, or whatever, and they should recognize it and pay up and be nice to us, and so forth. Nowadays, everyone needs security. Everyone feels insecure, whether it's because you want to have ships to patrol the Mediterranean to stop migrants, whether it's because you want to have tanks on your border in case of the big bad Russians come after you, or whatever. If you have security to offer, other people want to be your friend. And even legitimacy. I mean, on a really trivial nature, everyone loves a parade. Armed forces are used as a way of showing national virility. They're a way of showing pride in your nation. You want to support this government because we look after our boys in uniform and so forth. They're political instruments. So armies have got into a much broader sense of politics. But I think what's more interesting and frankly more worrying, what I want to close with, is the extent to which actually lots of other actors have been moving into the security power realm. We have the rise of private military companies. You want an army? Don't worry, you can hire one. Even the Russians are getting into that realm now. But a lot of corporations, particularly when they're operating in other countries in the developing world, have their own in-house forces that are often near enough private armies themselves. Organized crime is increasingly, again, it's certainly in countries with relatively poor levels of internal security, essentially becoming a state with its own army. If you look at what's happening in Mexico today. But also in terms of co-optation, in terms of other ways, generally speaking, we find that the violent forms of power, just at the time when the civil forms of power are rising, we also find that the more coercive forms of power are also rising. And I'll just close by going back to my own sort of area of expertise with Russia. Now, I don't believe that Russia has any, for example, plans to invade Europe. Instead, Russia is launching an exceedingly aggressive political campaign to divide us, to destabilize us, to subvert us, to scare us. Because in the final instance, that is just as good. That is another form of coercion. We don't have to fear a Russian tank coming across our borders if we fear a Russian hacker breaking down our electrical power grid. If we fear that Russian subversion is going to raise the specter of all kind of unpleasant extremist movements. Basically, power, violent power, hard power, has now actually become much, much more broad and diffuse. And the whole world of power, therefore, is changing.
Thank you very much. That gives us a lot of, the three of you gave us a lot of food for thought. I would like to start, before giving you the chance to jump in, to ask Jan and also Flavia and Mark about something that Jan said about the EU, which struck me. You said the European Union has had power that everybody wanted to copy or everybody wanted to join. Actually, I think you're a bit pessimistic because I think a lot of people still want to join the EU, even though some of them want to leave. But what is interesting here is that I think what you described is soft power. Now, can we, and Mark gave us another example, the opposite example of Russia, which is exercising different types of hard power and adjusting to new technologies and so on. But I think we can objectively say that there's not too much of soft power being exercised by Russia. Can you, if you're a country or government, have hard power without soft power, or can you just have soft power without hard power?
John A. is a good friend, so I don't want to undermine his concept of soft power, but the distinction between hard and soft is rather slippery. You can say, yes, we show the model to progress to trade. Yeah? But in order, if you want to trade with us, you have to also meet some values. You shouldn't use children labor. You should have some environmental standards and safety standards, safety standards. And this is all you can say. It's very noble. It's soft. It's a reference to our values. But for most of those countries, there is no real choice, because for them not to have access to our market is to be condemned to periphery status. So obviously, this is in a way hard power, you can say, because you impose your values on others, and you can say, yes, Chinese people also want to drink clean water and not to play with tools which are toxic. But at the end of the day, those developing countries can never catch up with us unless they save somewhere, right? And therefore, they often, child work in factories, they often put up with environmental standards which for our people wouldn't be acceptable. So I don't think this distinction is important. But it emphasizes here what I said, the story, is that power without purpose doesn't make any sense. That, we basically put this not only because of our competitive position and if they would not accept our values, we would simply suffer in the competition because their product will be cheaper and our too expensive and we'll be out of business. So there is some mechanism here at play of power. But we do it principally because we believe it's certain norms. We believe that children shouldn't be exploited in the labor market. We believe that those who work should have certain rights, and even if it costs us in the competition with others which do not have. We believe in environmental principles because climate change is evolving on our eyes, and we are interdependent in this. So we basically use mechanisms of power or sources of power to meet certain values. Because if we reduce conversations of power to the communication or manipulation, then you are in the world of Trumps. You see, in the sense that it doesn't matter whether you cause with power good or evil, as long as you simply can manipulate everybody else. And communication is not invented just in the internet era. I grown up when we called communication propaganda. We did it in different ways. Yes.
Yeah. Mark, do you think Russia can someday exercise soft power?
I mean, to an extent, I must admit, I would agree with Jan that there's this dichotomy between soft and hard power isn't truly sort of there. Especially because a lot of soft power does depend on a form of coercion. It's, you're a bad person if you don't give to this charity. Are they giving to the charity because they believe in its cause or because they don't want people to think they're a bad person? I mean, you know, and yet that may well be a very, very good cause. But when we come to Russia, I mean, this is an interesting case because, yes, there are not many people who around the world are sitting there thinking, gosh, I wish my country was more like the Russian Federation. What there are is a bunch of would-be strongmen leaders who are saying, gosh, I wish I was more like Putin. I wish I didn't have to worry about parliament. I wish people buy calendars of me without a shirt on, or whatever. So there is a kind, again, even if we're talking about the soft power of example, there is what in sort of economic terms would be called market segmentation. That ordinary people may not be envious of their counterparts in Russia, but a certain number of dictators and sort of thuggish populist leaders like aspects of Russia. And so I think this is the point. We need to appreciate the extent to which actually we're talking about this incredibly complex environment. Because frankly, even if you look at hard power, just as you might say power without purpose is meaningless, hard power without will is meaningless. And again, I think this is one of the issues in the world today. How can Russia, a country with an economy the size of Spain's, and I mean this with no disrespect to Spain, but nonetheless, you know, a country with an economy the size of Spain, a smaller population than the European Union and so forth, a declining economy in many ways, but nonetheless, how can we be so scared about it? And in many ways, it's precisely because it's willing to take risks and perform actions that we're not. Now, I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that we're restrained, that we have values and morals, and we have democratic elections that mean that we can't put in a government that says, let's spend 40% of our budget on security. But as far as I think Putin and his friends think, that's our weakness, that their secret weapon is will. So again, it's this mix of capability and the will and the capacity to use it, and the purpose to which it'll be used. That's the kind of the equation of power, I would say.
Thank you. Flavia, and then prepare your questions because I'll turn to you after this. You mentioned the media and the media scene, and it's a field I know well, and the mainstream media feel that they have lost the power to have an impact on political campaign or on decision making, and that now the power is much more atomized among users and readers and people who use the social media, which should help the populists in a way, but you have managed to use this to your advantage. So how do you see this transfer of power, and what should how should we do to take advantage of it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to come back on something you said, Jan. I mean, in this specific case I was mentioning, it was about whether you win on that day or not, so it was a campaign. And basically we were referring to the liberal values in our constitution. So I wouldn't see it that much as a propaganda, as you mentioned it, but rather as a making people confident again and that they know again about what the liberal values in our common constitution are about. Some sort of, I don't know, the enlightenment of people, you know, time and again, because I think that is what this is about, and especially in these days where we see strong right-wing populism coming up and back. This is a task like civil society has. We should make people understand how institutions work together and how we actually are depending on them to guarantee freedom. And that's basically what we want to do with my organization. And so it also, there are many discussions these days when you speak of migration or other questions then of security, that's how it is then framed, where this equation is made between freedom and security, or security, what can you do? And I think these are fields where exactly the same questions are coming up time and again. And to your question about social media, I want to say, to me, it's just new channels, but it's not, I mean, it is, of course, changing the landscape, and I see the challenges to media. But, I mean, to give you one example, how we interacted in this campaign with the media somehow. I mean, we just saw really little activism on the media side, to be honest, about fact-checking this right-wing populist party and about what they were telling us in the campaign. So we just did it ourselves, you know. We were actually doing the work of journalists, and we were publishing the 5 biggest lies of the right-wing populists in a leaflet that they were bringing to all the Swiss households, you know. And all of a sudden, the following week, news number 1 was fact-checking the right-wing populists. And then somehow it started to turn around again. But for us, it was a really important moment in the campaign. So that's how we interact also with the normal media.
That's the power of truth, but it doesn't always work, as we saw in the Brexit campaign, for instance, because there was also this attempt to fact-check a lot of lies, I think we may say, which were uttered during the campaign, and it obviously didn't always go through.
On both sides, yeah?
On both sides, you are absolutely right, yes. I'll take a couple of questions. If you have, yes, in the front here. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. So, here, and then we have some in the back. Yes, 2 in the back. So maybe we'll take those 3. Yeah, go ahead.
Since I already used my privilege of sitting in the
Yes.
front seat, I'll try to be brief. My question would be addressed towards all the participants of the debate, and it's related to the question of economic and social inequalities. For the last 40 years, we've seen an enormous growth of the levels of inequality, and how do you think it affects the distribution of power? Because it's been mentioned here that the power has been dispersed on the social media, but looking from a bit different point of view, by consolidating the power over the cyber monopolists, well, actually, there are those who are able to profit from not only distribution of information, but also from the market revenue. So it's a new situation, and how do you think the question of power is related to that consolidation?
Maybe we'll answer this while the mic can go in the back. Yes.
Oh, look, there is no doubt that the system which we had over the last few decades was not just tolerating, but stimulating inequalities. And we were, in a way, you know, today everybody talks about Piketty and so, but the inequalities didn't start yesterday and didn't fall from the sky. They were results of a very conscious policies and a legal system. And the very fact, you know, for instance, that after financial crash, practically nobody who was responsible for the totally irresponsible behavior in financial market was condemned, was that this was pretty legal what they were doing, because the whole policy was to deregulate and, you know, and basically leave it for the banking sector to run those things to a large extent. And even after the crisis, at least in Britain, the self-regulation was the term, and we know how it ended. There hardly was any change, and therefore people 10 years after last crash talk about new coming. And this crash produced enormous inequalities, both within sectors of society, but also between countries. I mean, go to Greece and you see what is there. But it doesn't mean that those, so to speak, poorer have no means of action. And it's not only because of industrial action, which is difficult to organize in this precariat. But we in communists used to joke, you know, that you pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. In in the neoliberal version of precariat, it's exactly the same. You pretend to take care of our labor rights, and we pretend that we are loyal employees. I mean, the loyalty of people in precariat to the institutions is as great as the loyalty of employers to them. So there is this interdependence which I tried to flag, that you know, that unless you make people believe that they are part of the project, you cannot really get their loyalties. And if you cannot get the loyalties, you are basically being cheated, or you don't get the things which people are supposed to do. So it's not one-way street, so to speak. But there is no doubt that the system as it was generating inequalities and did little to stop it. What is worse, we don't see meaningful ways of changing it. But it's another conversation.
You want to, Flavia or Mark? No.
Very briefly, again, I mean, going back to this point about, I think, multiple forms of power. In economic power, absolutely, we have seen a greater concentration and a greater widening of the gap between rich and poor. But on the other hand, I mean, I do think there are now new forms of political and social power that are available to the otherwise powerless, which is one of the reasons for the sort of all these attempts to essentially capture mass opinion, whether it's through propaganda or whether it's through rich people now sort of trumpeting their charitable roles and so forth. And I think what we're actually seeing is, I mean, I think we are in the middle of a process of adaptation, but I think it's clear there is a general, in the West, legitimacy crisis. Old political structures, which really are products of the 1950s, are less and less feeling relevant. And we're just beginning to get to the point when people are trying to define alternatives. And that's always a messy thing in the moment. We have a left that is trying to move beyond essentially discredited old models. We have a right, populist right, that is also emerging. We're not quite sure where this journey is going to take us, but I think one of the driving factors behind it is precisely this sense of the disconnect between rhetoric, between political power and increasing democratization, and actually economic increasing stratification.
So we have a question there. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Gerd Röbern from Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Warsaw as well. I would like to follow up on what Mr. Galeotti just said. It's actually comparing the times 1950s, 1960s and now. How far would you say that ordinary people have now really more to say in the game of power? Yes, people who are consumers, as citizens, as activists. What would be the real criteria to say that our generation is more powerful than the generation of our fathers or grandfathers or grandmothers, of course, as well?
You mean in general or in, yes?
That we can influence the game, so to say, politically more than they could, or maybe not. And it's just others are playing the game that we are watching.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the key thing is the broadening of opportunities for the expression of power, the varieties of types of power. And I think that is what is crucial. If we look back to more stratified, deferential, class-conscious eras, there were actually surprisingly few ways in which you could move into a position of power if you were not born into it. If you were particularly lucky and through education, maybe there was the trade union movement, there was the church. But actually, there were really only quite sort of tightly defined areas, but each of which actually had their own power structure. If you wanted to rise through a political party, well, you had to join one of the existing political parties and work your way up and do all the various things. Essentially, you got socialized. What I do think we have in the world today, which is one of the reasons that it's both exciting and frustrating, is precisely a lack of barriers to entry into all kinds of different areas. Politics, business, thought leadership, etc. You know, people can, in a way, set themselves up now, whether it's in terms of they have got one really smart entrepreneurial idea. You don't have to have been born to a multi-millionaire to be able to set that up in the age of Kickstarter and whatever else. The fact that now, you know, so much more is able through the world, as we've heard, of social activism politics, but also just generally, you know, people can begin to shape the world through their Twitter accounts and Instagram feeds. I mean, I think the thing is that you might say why we have a problem at the moment is we have political structures that are not geared for this highly pluralistic model. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of find some way of moving towards. But in that respect, I'm assuming that democratization of power is a good thing. I'm actually uplifted and optimistic.
Yes, go ahead.
I totally disagree with this. Because we have to. Because, you know, it's like with the football clubs, those of you who are interested. It's true that sometimes poorer club can win matches against richer clubs. And even take championship. Leicester is a good example here, and there are in other countries good example. But it doesn't mean, this only means that it's not enough to have money to have a strong football club. But statistically, it's not by accident that the richer clubs always are stronger than more poor clubs.
It does help.
And the same applies to the society. What we have here in various manifestations, and this anti-liberal clash is exactly manifested by Podemos movement when they, and this is related to your question directly, you know, when people came to demonstrations in Spain with this, you know, banners saying we have a vote, but we don't have a voice, because the mechanism of democracy we had basically made it impossible for them to change policies. They could change government, but not policies. And this kind of frustration caused a lot of anger. So this is always about the balance, you know, and institutions which can transform, you know, a vote into a voice. And this balance has been somehow broken, and therefore there is frustration in all local contexts of a different manifestation. And this is important to see this, because if this is a sign of people who feel powerless, that, you know, that they really cannot influence the course of this. And the answer for the reasons are very complex. You know, some will point to exactly to the power of markets over power of democracies, that the markets, you know, basically can get away with anything. So governments cannot change policies because markets will punish them. Others will focus on institutions which prevent you to do things like European Commission, by the way. In Italy, you have very legitimate discussion. Who actually, you know, you had elections, they won with the second mandate, and the European Commission said, no, you cannot implement your electoral promises. Well, interesting proposition. You know, and in other cases, people talk about more informal networks behind, not the formal kind of veto players. But so we don't know how it is, but there is this frustration, and this is why we had rather a turbulent political scene recently.
Flavia,
I just want to make a quick comment between the two positions, I think, because one thing that strikes me more often is, even though when people get the more rights and more freedom, more influence, I sometimes feel that they don't want to take the responsibility that comes with it. So,
why?
And to me, this would be, if you want the freedom, you need to take the responsibility as well, because I see a lot of criticism, but then I'm not really sure how willing people are to actually take responsibility. That's at least how I also observe it in Switzerland, where sometimes people aren't conscious that by exercising their vote, they're changing our constitution. It's not just some like, oh, I was not content with something, so I just, you know. But people need to be aware of this, and this is, I think, a democratic cultural thing somehow. We need to reinforce people and to be aware of the responsibility that comes with it.
So that the more atomized power is, in fact, the less prepared people are to take responsibility.
Yeah, so to what Mark said, I mean, to me also, I mean, I'm totally fine if you come up with your startup and you have a perfect idea, whatever, but you're an entrepreneur and it brings a certain responsibility with it. And I think we're losing a bit this culture somehow, and I'm not happy about this at all.
Okay, so here, we have two here.
Piotr Kozioł. I have a question which probably concerns all panelists, but my concern is that we are a bit too optimistic. There is a question of dynamics, and populism causes or explores situations that can get out of control. A simple example, which is like a soft example, is Brexit. Who knows? It's probably going to happen, but nobody had foreseen the consequences when it happened. The hard example is the way Europe was evolving in the 1930s. Hitler got to power in a democratic society, yes? He won elections. What happened later was completely, it was a surprise to the world that pretended not to see when it was coming. My concern is now that we cannot foresee processes that are irreversible. The dynamics could be modeled, but I'm afraid that Wałęsa said in the transformation of Poland, we achieved going back from the fish soup into aquarium. I don't think that's possible anymore. So please tell me that I can still remain optimistic when the world is governed by Trump and maybe some devious billionaires like who sponsored Cambridge Analytica that play with micro-targeting of individuals to accomplish their devious schemes. Tell me I can still remain optimistic.
So that goes back to what you said in the beginning. Power is, what matters is what you do with power, what you want to do, or define rationality. Or
yes, but see, people change their mind, you know, and they change constitutions too. What is unacceptable is to change constitutions without having, you know, constitutional majorities and that kind of things. But these are not sacred things. The same, you know, we cannot just abolish elections because our friends are not winning any longer. No. I mean, in politics is to talk to the electorate and convince them to your visions of what is good and what is evil. And so the same you can say about power. Power is associated with a lot of evil, but you cannot do any good without power either. And therefore, we fight those elections. Therefore, I fully agree with you. You have to convince young people, for instance, now in elections to vote, that the vote really counts. Well, how can you do this if they feel that it doesn't? You need to regain credibility. And you don't regain credibility only talking about your political enemies. You have to first look into the mirror and to say, look, maybe we've done something wrong. Maybe those who did something wrong should take consequences of this. And maybe we should allow those young people not, you know, to actually have ownership of the project and not to do policies only for them, so to speak, yeah? So you have to, you know, this is all about legitimacy, as you said. And if you have legitimacy, you know, it doesn't mean that you have, that you don't need to have electoral campaigns, that you don't need communication. This is all important. But the essence here is that you have to, you see, interests are not given. They are public interests. You have to negotiate your visions of interest and direction with your public. Otherwise, you know, you are just petty manipulator.
Do you have any particular situation in mind, or
well,
country?
I think it can be applied to all countries, but of course in local variation, because you know, Trump is not Kaczynski, and Kaczynski is not Salvini. They are all different, but the situation is the same. Yeah. As Clinton is not like Hollande, Hollande is not like David Cameron. So you see. And people would never understand why Berlusconi was so popular in Italy to win so many elections, and why he's funny in the first place. Right? like for you, it's very difficult to understand why Kaczynski is funny. Is here, you know, popular. But this is all urban. But this is, But
it is important to try to understand, right, absolutely. Yeah.
But there is a common trend here, but there are local variations, because we have all kind of, we speak different languages and we find different things funny.
But there are indeed a lot of common features. Flavia, you wanted to...
I just wanted to thank Jan for this wonderful comment. I totally agree, really. Just maybe 2 more points from my side. I think this is what it is about. It's a plebiscite of every day, and we need to every day work on this order we have. And I really liked also what you said about to involve the young generation, because I think that's the only chance we have. And on the other hand, really to develop a vision, a positive, optimistic vision for the future, which is inclusive, but really so we can have an optimism which is common to most people.
Thank you. So basically this is not 1930 at the moment.
No, actually, I mean, let me actually explicitly, briefly sort of talk about that. I mean, there's a certain mythology about Hitler. When Hitler was actually invited into power, his vote had already peaked and it was actually diminishing. So in other words, he'd already was at his high watermark. How did Hitler get into power? It was because the elites invited him. They thought they could control him. They thought that he would be useful. And obviously, we know how badly that went. But I think in some ways, exactly, I think that the Hitler example is actually one of where you have elites that do not have constraints on their power. So the broadening out of power, the sort of the taking away just their ability to decide, oh, we like this guy, let's give him a shot, I think is actually sort of a good thing. And let me also touch on from Hitler to Brexit. There is a major difference. But I mean, it seems bizarre to say this, given that Britain is, you know, on the permanent member of the Security Council, one of the biggest sort of economies in Europe, whatever. But in many ways, Brexit was created by a belief in powerlessness. However foolish and muddle-headed it undoubtedly was, the people who voted Brexit to a considerable extent did so because they somehow thought that they were not being heard. And again, I think it goes back to this issue of inclusiveness. You know, whether we're talking on the level of an individual, whether we're talking on the level of a generation, or whether we're talking on the level of a country, I mean, I think one of the crucial lessons of the moment is that the most dangerous thing is for people to believe they have no stake in the status quo. For people to think that any change is better. That's the problem.
So when they say take back control, it's also take back control individually, right? Yeah. Please.
Alexandra Sava is my name, and my question is for Flavia, because you talked about how it changed how we consume media, and how you have to have 5 words on a picture or a meme to get to people, to really get to people. And firstly, I just want to say that I admire your acceptance of and realism of that, and that you use it effectively. Because I worked as a media analyst for a brief period of time in a political party, and it was a liberal party, and I'm devastated because I came to a conclusion, and I wanted to ask if you share that conclusion, that that by itself, the fact that we shifted to 5 words and a picture, and we shifted to a meme, causes the whole kind of battlefield to be skewed towards the populist parties, because they can actually, it's easier for them to put their message in 5 words in a picture, because you can say, I don't know, let's take back control, or 500 złotych per child, and you can just put it on a poster. But then you have topics that liberal parties want to pursue. They're serious economic topics, and you cannot simply put them, like you cannot explain to Polish people why we should accept euro in Poland in 5 words and a picture. That, and also the fact that how media actually, when I worked in a political party, I've seen how media actually has a lot of influence on what topics, at what time the political party will pursue. I actually came to a conclusion that they have more control over it than the board of that party, because they have to play towards how the media runs it and what's the atmosphere right now. And I'm just afraid that unless this is the battle that we fight, unless we try to change that communication back to full sentences and like real analysis, we're not gonna win the war with populism.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
And
So
we have
just
2 more
quickly,
questions.
thank you for your question or remark. Basically, this is not the only thing we do, of course. I mean, we do a lot of talking in little, you know, like groups where you can make longer sentences, where you can explain stuff. But in terms of campaigns, I strongly want to encourage liberals to try to be brief, because I really can tell you it's possible. And we should really strongly try to be innovative and see it a bit as a competition still. Because, and the third thing that you were mentioning, and here I play the ball a bit back to the media as well, I think at least in Switzerland, I see that media realized more again the responsibility they have by shaping discourses, and that they should give more space to longer arguments. That's at least what I observe a bit, but of course it's not enough. But this is this meta discourse that I see happening a bit, yeah.
Okay, since we started later, we can take a couple more questions. So we have one here, and one here, and I think we'll be done. Yeah. Okay. So.
Thank you, Adam Bralczyk. Once a leading Polish politician expressed his view that the state has a monopoly to coerce. I mean, that's a privilege for the state, for the government, to have a feeling that it has the sole power to coerce a citizen, organization, or economic entity to do anything what suits the state. I wonder if we do not underestimate the importance of the concept of the state for people. Because like you have mentioned the status quo, I think the most comfortable status quo people can refer to is the state. I mean, everyone possesses ID card, citizenship. I think that more and more people, actually dissatisfied people, if they are going to look for help, they are going to expect the state to give them the hand. Not international bodies, not Europe will come to and rescue us, the governments of their own states. And I would wonder, where is the concept, the role of the state in the current political landscape of Europe, for example?
I'm happy to take it. Look, I don't think anybody would ignore that states are still there, and our reference point. If only they just not only, have monopoly of quasi-monopoly of issuing laws, but also control institutions like United Nations or even the EU is totally controlled by nation states. But having said that, there are two questions you should ask yourself. First, there are states and states. Germany is a state, and Greece is the state, and Cyprus is the state, and Somalia is a state. See, so they have obviously different capacity to do certain things. And I don't know how much people in those various countries can really count on the state to meet their needs. Second, even those most powerful states not just lost, but consciously deprived themselves of doing the things they traditionally did. I mean, people always say this globalization, but globalization didn't come from the sky, nor did it come from China. We have deregulated, privatized everything. We were leaders of this, and even if technology was a factor here, we supported all these technology enterprises ourselves. We gave them all free hand to do whatever. And why I'm saying those things is that capacity of states is greatly reduced, not just in economics, when we accept that states cannot really challenge markets. In my view, the last person who tried to do it was President Mitterrand, and we know how it ended. But even in such a field like defense, I wonder how can you have a national defense in the situation that nuclear weapons are in the sky and we are faced with cyber attacks? I mean, what? We have in this country, new idea that we give young patriots a uniform and a gun, and they will walk on the Polish flag, patriotic songs, and then what? And then they will face a cyber attack, and what they will do. I mean, we have to understand that things have changed. So you have to think about not just economic sovereignty, but also national defense in totally different ways. But our narrative is very statist. I agree, it's statist. And in the EU, I always say this, that I cannot understand how come that at this decision-making table are only states, some of them tiny, like Latvia, which is as large as this.
Or Luxembourg.
Or Luxembourg, or Cyprus. What is, with all respect for Cyprus, what kind of state it is? Is it sovereign? Is it failed? And if there is anybody from Cyprus, I don't want to offend them, but they know what I mean. And you don't have cities like Paris or Hamburg with so much greater economic potentials, which actually deal with migrations much better than states do, which are engines of innovation. They don't have access to decision making, they don't have access to resources, nothing. I mean, this is absurd. This means that our institutions do not catch up with the world out there. And this, of course, makes it difficult for us to do the good, or if you wish, for the purpose of this title of the session, to exercise power in a purposeful way for the benefit of the people.
Yeah, there's a field, if I may, where this may be a little bit changing. It's in environment, where, for instance, in the Paris Agreement on climate change, since the US withdrew from this treaty, then the other states are reaching out to states within the United States, individual states, to cities, to corporations, to try to circumvent this refusal of the nation state. So there are efforts to change or to adapt to this.
I recently had dinner with Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, the Director General of Geneva. I said, what do you do these days? And he said, well, most of the things, I'm looking for money.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for money not to states, member states, because they only cut their contributions. I talk to business, I talk to cities, I talk to regions, and particularly in the development goals, these are the serious partners. States are not serious partners, he said. They are spoilers, but don't cite me, he said.
Okay, you, and we'll have the last one here, and then we'll close.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrzej Hałasiewicz, thank you for a very interesting discussion, but really I will appreciate that the panelists will try to answer the question, who holds the power now? You could choose the area of subject yourself and limit it very much, but please tell me in 3 sentences, who holds the power now? Thank you very much.
I can try. Thank you for the question. I think if we as the civil society or the people or whoever don't want the institutions to exist anymore, then they won't exist anymore. So basically, I think we have the biggest power. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I was trying to think of how one can actually bring it down to five words. And similarly, I'd say it's whoever you give it to. I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, and again, it's fitting that we're talking about this in one of the former Warsaw Pact countries, that it doesn't matter, you know, in the long term, I'd stress, it doesn't matter how many tanks, how large a secret police apparatus or whatever, ultimately legitimacy from below is the only thing that really will survive and nourish a working state.
I tried to say it at the beginning. It depends for what. It depends what you want to use the power, because without the purpose you don't know. And in all these games, it depends what you want to get and what you want others to do for you. There's a different consider, and power is never absolute. It's nothing like this, you know. There's no out there conspiracy of some secret lodge which runs the world. Forget.
Okay, you'll have the last question.
Jan Chromiec, Battery Foundation. I see that the consensus on the panel is that there is no single locus of power. But I would like to concentrate on one actor, namely political parties, which in the end might have limited power, but still they have formal rights. My question is simple. How would you motivate people to join and get engaged in political parties?
That's a good question. I'll just, before you answer, point out of the situation of France, where we don't have real functioning political parties at the moment. So that, I mean, we do have some political parties, but they're all in some form of disarray, and the one which is in power is not, properly speaking, a political party. It's still a movement. So that tells you something about the power of political parties. Now, please answer.
So I can answer it from my perspective, also being the co-founder of a political movement. And first we were founding it because we were so desperate about the parties, because we found them so defaitistisch, you know, like they were just lying down, they gave up vis-a-vis the right-wing populists. We were so disappointed. So we said, we don't want to go into the parties, even though we are very political. But now, coming up the elections, we are actually thinking, like, how can we take part, influence the elections somehow? Because of course it's clear to us that that's where power, like in terms of laws and so on, is being like exercised. So, but for me, to answer your question, it would be representation, so that like there are more women in politics and more difference of generations in politics, so you really feel that you are part of this whole thing, and that the people really feels represented. And I especially say it as a young woman here. Yeah.
I mean, I can't disagree with that. I suppose I would just take a slightly different perspective, or more point, sort of pose a question from a slightly different perspective. Actually, are parties really how in the future we're going to structure our politics? I mean, my concern is that as soon as you create these structures, after a certain point, almost invariably, you will end up with, entrenched groups who run it, the zappy 30-year-olds who sort of created it and had all the energy will in due course be, and I can say this with plumpish 50-year-olds, who are much more sort of set in their ways and assume that the answers to today's politics are the same answers as 20 years back. I mean, I think that there is a question about whether in the modern world a party works. A party was a great way when you needed to have an instrument that could appeal to a mass electorate that really could not get involved in politics in any other way. And through, various structures that, wards elected representatives who maybe for a constituency would elect a candidate to stand for election and so forth, provided some form of representation. Maybe we're heading into a world where actually parties are going to be more of a problem than they are the answer. But for the moment, I appreciate they're what we've got.
Thank you. Jan, you'll have the last word. No? You agree with this. So, so we can go on to the coffee break, I guess, before the next session. Thank you very much to our panelists. I think, I'm not sure we have the definite answer on who holds power, but at least we have, I think, covered quite a lot of ground on
This afternoon you have.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions.